I'm delighted to be back after a long hiatus, a hiatus that went on longer than I had anticipated. Well, I should now be back on track for weekly uploads going forward. As always, please like and subscribe. Liking a video really helps boost the profile, so please do that. So now, history and meaning, Homer, Plato and Polybius. There's a saying going around the internet, and I'm sure you're all familiar with it. It comes up with almost predictable regularity on things like the Twitter feed. It goes like this, quote, "Hard times create strong men create good times create weak men, and weak men create hard times," end quote. This quote comes from a post-apocalyptic novel by the author G. Michael Hopf. Whether it is true or not is neither here nor there. I happen to think it is true, but what really interests me about it is that it expresses an old and recognizable theory of history, namely that there is identifiable causality in history and there is a cyclical pattern that reproduces definite states of affairs over time and which are due to determinate historical causes. So I want to begin this new season with some talks on history, specifically the philosophy of history. I've planned some talks on St. Augustine's theological understanding of history as providential. It's mainly set out in his magnum opus, The City of God. Giambattista Vico's comprehensive theory of history, set out in the early 18th century in his New Science, and Hegel's philosophy of history, and a couple of other related topics. But for now, I want to begin by raising a few points and observations about this whole notion that history can be independently meaningful. And by this I mean the following, that the meaning of history, if it has one, is discovered rather than imposed. Let's call this its independent meaning. That history itself could be independently meaningful seems to imply that there is a certain something at work in human events that goes beyond the immediate intentions of its human actors and the operations of nature. If natural and/or rational causes cannot explain some event, then some other external cause is sought. In Homeric times, it was the direct action of the various gods. Later, in the classical era, this kind of cause is collectively attributed to fortune, in Greek touche, or fortuna in Latin. The ancient historian Polybius, who lived between around 200 to 118 BC, places touche at the center of his historiography. It is, as he says, the distinctive feature of his history. Quote, "Fortune has turned almost all the events of the known world in a single direction and has forced everything to tend towards the same goal. A historian, then, should use his work to bring under a single conspectus for his readers the means by which fortune has brought everything to this point." End quote. He does not mean that fortune is the sole principle of explanation in history, because later he says that when natural causes are absent or irrelevant, or where rationality fails to explain the actions of the agents, recourse must be made to fortune. Fortune was itself divinized, usually conceived as being the daughter of the Titans, or even of Zeus himself, and there were temples dedicated to Touche, for instance the Tuchaion in Alexandria. To this day we still use the old Roman proverb, audentes fortuna aduat, fortune favors the brave. In our own time, people talk about luck to account for some unanticipated and unanticipatable event, good or bad, like winning the lottery or being struck by lightning. A well-known objection to this goes something like this. If we had the complete data set for natural event X, we would be able to give a scientific account for event X, such that we have no need for a concept like luck. But when data is missing or unobtainable, some put it down to luck or fortune. For instance, a complex set of mechanical causes explains why the roulette ball ended up in the slot that it did, but we cannot plot those causes in advance, nor can we reconstruct them after the fact. So the temptation for some is to appeal to luck or fortune. But this is irrational. Casinos make billions out of this kind of irrationality, while a solid grounding in the mathematics of probability might just have prevented one from entering the casino in the first place, or at least learn how to count cards, if one insists on going to casinos. The mechanistic objection to luck is compelling in the case of the roulette wheel, but what of this? The winner of the lottery is determined by the selection of a series of numbered balls taken out of a container full of such balls, and which, arrayed together in sequence, produce a quite lengthy set of numbers. Anyone who has a ticket with that identical sequence of numbers wins the lottery. But the sequence on the ticket, chosen by the purchaser long in advance of the draw, and the sequence selected from the container have absolutely no natural causal relationship. In this case, there is a course to luck as explanatory, would seem more justified, or if there is a causal relationship, it is not a mechanical one. A probabilistic mathematical explanation will tell us how this happens and why it is rare, but it cannot predict it, nor can it give an explanation as to why, say on the 6th of October 2020, Mr. Jones of Fineview Avenue, Smithville, had a sequence of numbers identical to the sequence chosen out of the container. My point with these examples is that for a historian like Polybius, and indeed any historian worth the name, there are causes which are neither natural, for instance mechanical, or rational, that is, the intended action of agents, which rationally conforms to what the situation objectively demands. For instance, a neighbouring state starts to make warlike moves, the rational response would be to prepare for war. Every historian will recognise a kind of cause that does not fall into either of the above, so let's call this non-natural and apparently non-rational cause the third cause. For a much earlier figure like Homer, there seems to be only two causes at work: free human actions and the individual interventions of the gods working in concert, individually or even at times in opposition to other gods. And here the tendency is to reduce what we and the later ancients recognized as natural causes to divine interventions. This is because the very notion of natural causes is a function of nature itself, a concept which had not been identified and conceptualized in Homer's time. That came later. The rise of the early philosophers from around the middle 7th century BC onwards, the so-called pre-Socratics, is a movement which is largely about the discovery of nature as a distinct domain governed by its own rules, and which can become to known as natural causes, and which we can acquire knowledge of such causes. The later ancients, writing in a time of philosophical maturity, like Polybius, distinguished between natural and rational causes, but also recognized a third cause, a cause which he calls fortune, which is given divine attributes. So, just a quick summary at this point. Homer, living in an age before philosophy, includes free human agency, for instance, the decision to go to war against Troy, and divine agency, including what we would designate as natural causes, that is, influencing human action through persuasion and deception, but also interfering in what we would call natural operations like raising storms or sending plagues and the like. Polybius then, much later, living in an era after the first maturity of philosophy, has three kinds of cause. Natural causes, for instance, earthquakes, storms, plagues, crop failures, that kind of thing. Rational causes, then, agents act according to a rational calculus demanded by the objective exigencies of a situation. And thirdly, fortuna, or touche, a cause that is neither natural nor rational in the above sense. From this all too brief survey, we can conclude that philosophy did play a crucial role in both the development of historical consciousness itself and historiography as the science of history writing. With some notable exceptions, philosophers in the Western tradition have largely excluded history as a proper subject of philosophical inquiry. There are good reasons for this. History deals with reconstructing past events in some meaningful way, and usually in a narrative form. History of its nature consists of particularity and uniqueness, but philosophy, on the other hand, is concerned with universal truths and normative reasoning. This is a fairly obvious distinction and accounts for the disciplinary boundaries between philosophy and historiography, but when we dig a little, we find questions about history that do bear on universal truths and normative reasoning. One can't delve into history for too long before certain questions start to emerge. For instance, how does the past both shape and produce the present? And I don't just mean the more immediate past, but also the distant past. In other words, what do we really mean when we talk about historical causes? What are they? We see this already in a comparison between the worlds of Homer and of Polybius. How do we explain the fact that we can and do discern patterns in history, despite the unique character of the events and actors that compose the substance which the historian must use to compose a coherent and meaningful narrative of the past? What is the use of historical narratives to the living? Is historical consciousness itself a, so to speak, hardwired human attribute, or is it an additional development produced through living in urban forms of society? I add this last question because there have been human societies which have remained unchanged for very long periods of time, have existed in isolation or relative isolation, and which did not develop historical consciousness, and which did not possess a history in the significant sense. Such societies did have grand sense-making narratives, for instance the Dreamtime of Australian Aboriginals, a complex and complete narrative tradition that supplies the same kinds of needs that religion, philosophy, science and historiography do for us. That is, to make sense of the world and everything in it, and to give guidance to the living. Okay, so can we call Dreamtime a kind of mythology? And is the internal logic of the Homeric world closer to that of Australian Dreamtime than it is to ours, because of this mythic frame? If nothing new ever happens, if life continues for us just as it did for our distant ancestors, then an account of the here and now will differ in no way from an account of the distant past, except the individuals who are different. The question of history just does not arise, but where history does arise, that is, where the new and the transformative does occur, mythic narratives will be wholly inadequate and will inevitably give way to what we recognize as history, that is, as a new form of narrative which can handle socially transformative change. These are intriguing questions, which I cannot take up here for now. I only want to make the point that historical consciousness itself may not be a natural attribute, but the consequence of living in a certain kind of society. Given that we are talking about social forms that do have history, then from these simple observations and questions emerge a deeper and more fundamental question, that is, if patterns can be detected in past events, does history itself have an objective meaning? By this I mean not just the obvious sense in which patterns in history are discernible, for instance, the regular rise and fall of empires, but something deeper. Is there something like an underlying plan? And by that I mean a plan that is itself independent and outside of human intention and agency. Plan may not be the best word, but we'll have to do for now, and I introduce it as a counterpoint to fortune, which seems to be the opposite of plan. It implies just chance, pure chance. So now we have another candidate for historical causality. Let's call it the plan. Could it be that what Polybius calls fortune or luck points to the causal influence of something deeper, something like an active intelligence? I say this because in ancient thought there was an ongoing preoccupation with what they call in Greek pronoia, or in Latin providentia, and it's a term which denotes both individual intention and what we mean by divine providence, that is, divine intention. For instance, an individual who projects into the future some plan or set of aims and then goes about realizing those aims is doing so because they are exercising pronoia. So too, in ancient literature from the very earliest documents, there is a preoccupation with the role of the gods in human affairs. Do the gods or God have a plan which involves human cooperation or even resistance? We can see this already in the very earliest text of the Western tradition, Homer's Iliad, a story set during the final stages of the Trojan Wars, and where the gods are deeply involved in the course of the war over time. Different gods supported different sides, and even different individual actors in the story through their ongoing interventions. One brief example should suffice to illustrate the point. The narrative of Book 1 of the Iliad opens with the war already having been underway for some years. Indeed, it's now nearing its end. The Greeks, or Achaeans as they are known at this stage, have captured Chryseis, the daughter of a Trojan priest of the god Apollo called Chrysis, and she has become the personal captive of Agamemnon, the supreme leader of the Achaeans. Chrysis offers a generous ransom for his daughter's release, and most of the Achaean leadership are agreeable to this arrangement, but Agamemnon refuses it. Chryses then prays to Apollo, imploring him to intervene, which he does, by sending a plague that ravages the Achaean army for 9 days. The great Achilles calls a convention for the Achaeans to try and resolve this calamity. It's finally agreed that Chryses will be returned to her father, thus hopefully ending the plague, but Agamemnon will take as compensation Brissos, another great beauty taken as a captive in an earlier battle in the campaign by Achilles. This is a direct assault on Achilles' honour and ignites his rage against Agamemnon, which, as it will turn out, is the theme of the entire poem, the rage of Achilles. Achilles withdraws from the campaign, stays in his tent, and refuses to rejoin the battle until his honour is restored. He then prays to his mother, Thetis, a minor goddess. His father was immortal, the king of Phthia, and he prays to her to implore her to intervene by allowing the Trojans to beat the Achaeans right back to the shoreline so that their ships will be in danger of destruction. In this way, Agamemnon will then be forced to realize that Achilles is indispensable to military success and will thus make restitution to the latter, and by so doing, restore his honour. Now, by the end of Book 1, there have been further divine interventions by Zeus, the supreme Olympian god, and the goddesses Hera, Athena, and Aphrodite. All their interventions have a direct impact on the course and eventual outcome of the war, but in many cases, this really depended on how humans reacted to those interventions. The gods could not force an action from a human. The people in Homer are not marionettes controlled by the gods. Their actions are always self-initiated. Their initiatives are free, even if they are still reacting to divine deception or severe pressure, such as the plague sent by Apollo. With this example from Homer, we can see how the past, in this case the 10-year-long Trojan War, is a complex series of events determined by an interactive mixture of divine and human agency. We can also see, with benefit of hindsight, that in Homer, history itself is being prefigured, despite the mythic framing of the action. Archaeology reveals the remains of a city that are almost certainly those of Troy. Agamemnon was likely an historical figure, even if that were not his name. A society resembling that of the Achaeans did exist. There is a gold death mask attributed to Agamemnon. Even if that was not his name, it obviously belonged to someone of great wealth and power, a king. Yet, despite such facts as are revealed by archaeology, and which support the existence of Troy and the world of the Achaeans and Agamemnon, Homer is still not writing history. In Homer we can see something like the first stirrings of history breaking out of myth. Now, much later, with the emergence of philosophy, the Greeks started to reconceive the world in a radical new way, often characterized later by scholars as the shift from mythos to logos, from complex storytelling using images to reason-giving accounts using arguments. The shift from mythologizing to philosophizing, the emergence of historiography, closely tracks this shift. This shift from mythos to logos is not only the emergence of philosophy, but of historiography as well. Yet, despite this massive discursive shift that's occurring, there was an underlying continuity with respect to the nature of human events, specifically for current purposes, the relation between humans and the gods, and the relationship between the gods and the world. Two major themes emerged. One, a perception of an underlying intelligible order to the world itself, what the Greeks called cosmos. Let's call this the ground of all things, and which accounts for the abiding cosmological interests of Greek philosophers. And second, the direct relation between gods and men, such as we see depicted in the mythic register throughout Homeric epic. By the 5th century BC, the time of Socrates, there was an emerging philosophical discussion of both cosmos and pronoia, or providence, and the interrelation between the two. However, in the matter of providence, these are only beginnings. It won't be until the Christian era that we encounter anything fully recognizable to us as a fully developed doctrine of divine providence, namely the continuous and cogent interventions of a personal God into the affairs of man according to his plan. So perhaps the very first properly philosophical discussion of this is in the thinking of the pre-Socratic philosopher Anaxagoras, who held that the totality of all things are caused and governed by nous. Now, semantically, nous is one of those Greek words that's context-dependent for translation. So, depending on the context, it can mean intuition or awareness as such, or even intellect. But in the current context, it denotes what we can only render as divine intellect, the mind of God, so to speak. An important source for our understanding of Anaxagoras' thought, then, is found in Plato's dialogue, the Phaedo, where the dramatic setting is the day on which Socrates is executed by hemlock poisoning, and where the central theme is, not surprisingly, the question about the immortality of the soul. In the course of the discussion, Socrates gives us something of his intellectual autobiography in order to explain his earlier dissatisfaction with various pre-Socratic philosophers' treatment of causation, because this part of the dialogue is mainly concerned with theories of causality and how he arrived at his own. I'll do a dedicated video on this in the future, but for now I'll only summarize that part, which is directly relevant to our topic. Socrates tells us that in his younger days, likely up to his early 40s, he was keenly interested in the various scientific theories that were circulating, most of which operated with a physicalist or mechanistic theory of causation, but because of serious shortcomings in this conception of cause, led him eventually into a state of deep dissatisfaction and perplexity. Then he discovered the works of Anaxagoras, and he lived between around 500 through to 428 BC, so his life would have overlapped with Socrates. And he stated that nous, or mind, directs and is the cause of everything, nous estin hod diakosmon tikapanton aetios, and about which he says the following, quote, "Now I was pleased with this explanation, and it somehow seemed appropriate to me that reason is the cause of all, and I decided that if this is the case, then reason, as it is ordering everything, orders and arranges each thing in the best possible manner. Therefore, if someone should wish to discover the cause according to which each thing comes into being, perishes, or is, then he needs to discover the best way for that thing to be, or undergo, or enact anything at all. And so, based on this account, a person should consider nothing else about himself or about anything else except what is most excellent and best. And then the same person necessarily knows what is worse, for the knowledge concerned with both is the same." End quote. An initial observation here. Socrates connects intellect or reason with the good, best is the superlative of good, on the implicit claim, not argued here, that pure intellect, or reason as we might say now, is itself governed by the good because it always orders things towards what is best. For a detailed examination of this connection between reason and the good, we should have to turn to Plato's Republic, so see my previous series on Plato's Cave 1 through 3, where I deal with this question. The argument can be summarized: if pure intellect or reason orders things, then it orders them towards what is best. While I'm leaving out a great deal from this section of the Phaedo for this video, I only want to draw one conclusion which bears directly on our topic. So let's review what we have here. The presence of order or pattern implies reason and rationality. If all things are ordered by intellect or reason, and if intellect is governed by the good, then all things are immediately governed by the good. From this we can only conclude that for Plato, all things are governed by the good, which, according to what he says, or what Socrates says at Republic 509b, it is a supreme transcendent principle which produces and governs through the ordering operations of nous, or intellect, reason. And transcendent because it's outside of all things, tapanta. It's epikanatezousias, beyond being, to use the phrase from the Republic. It's the cause of all things, but is itself not part of all things. So good here simply denotes that transcendent first principle which is outside all things, tapanta, that both grounds, causes, and can be used to explain all things. With this discussion of nous and causality in the Phaedo, Plato is setting out the idea that the world is ultimately governed by just such a principle that is itself outside the world and which is itself both good and supremely rational. In fact, it is also, and at the same time, the principle of reason itself. So far, this would do as a good explanation of the readily apparent orderliness of the universe, the cosmos, and the operations of nature, a comprehensive empirical and metaphysical cosmology. But our topic is history, and specifically a philosophical theory of history. Implicit in the very notion of human history is the concept of agency, that is, free active cause. Either God is some kind of grand puppet master, micromanaging events such that our undeniable subjective experience of agency turns out to be purely illusory, and we are no more than marionettes, or the world is such that it contains both divine, that is, transcendent causes, which include those of nature, if we think of nature as a form of mediation, and the possibility of human causes, that is to say, genuine human agency, or freedom to put it simply, and not just the subjective illusion of freedom. Genuine human agency presupposes the freedom of the will as a necessary condition. If we are only marionettes, then what we call history is nothing more than a detailed description of a divine puppet show, like a theatre review with knobs on. History proper, then, is only possible on the basis of human free will. While Plato's theories of cosmic agency and causality seem a long way from the Homeric worldview, and they are, there is nevertheless a discernible continuity here, namely on this very question of freedom. In both surviving epics, the Iliad and the Odyssey, we see events in this world coming about through a complex interaction between men and gods, willful men who project ambitions and goals onto the world, and the ubiquitous interventions of gods and goddesses, both aiding and impeding these human projects, different gods siding with one side, obstructing and even deceiving one another. For instance, the goddess Hera is a consistent supporter of the Achaean cause, while Apollo supports the Trojans. Elsewhere, Plato will reject Homer's characterization of the gods as divided in their plans, as inscrutable to humans, arbitrary, quarrelsome, meddlesome, and even mischievous towards us. However, he will retain and develop the basic idea of active divine intervention in human affairs, albeit in a form that does not compare to Homer's scheme. Plato's views come out most clearly in the critique of the poets in his Republic, on which I will make a dedicated presentation connected to this topic in the not-too-distant future. Plato will, throughout his works, and especially towards the end, in his longest work, The Laws, develop ideas of divine providence that differ markedly from anything that has gone before. But even with Plato, we're still a far cry from the personal God of the Christians, who governs all of human history and infuses it with any meaning it might have. This question about Plato's thoughts about divine providence really calls for a dedicated talk sometime later on. From all this, we have most of the essential ingredients for an explanatorily powerful theory of divine providence. Once we have such a theory of providence, we also have the possibility of an historiography that can discern an underlying objective meaning in the events that make up the substance of history. However, this possibility will not be fully realized until the conception of the cosmos itself has undergone a radical transformation, and this will only be effected when the Christian eschatological cosmology supplants the cyclical cosmology of the pre-Christian world order, a process which will transform cosmos into creation. Anticipating what's to come in this series, these origins, especially the Platonic intellectual inheritance, will help account for the tremendous importance of St. Augustine's providential history set forth in his great work, City of God, written on foot of the Visigothic sacking of Rome in 410 AD. There, Augustine sets out an eschatological cosmology, namely that the world is created out of nothing and will come to an end in some unspecified future. That's the cosmological part. But after creation, there comes the fall, a moral event, followed by a restoration in the form of the incarnation of Christ, who redeems a fallen world, that is, puts right the effects of the fall, and in this way reveals human history to have an objective meaning. Notable too, and this really is a revolutionary idea in the ancient world, the incarnation of Christ signifies God's direct entry into human history through the taking on of human form. More than any other, this was the most difficult idea for ancient man, that God demeans himself by taking on human flesh. And, just as a side point, it's precisely this difficulty which underlay all the Christological heresies of the early Church, Arianism, Nestorianism, Monophysitism, and so on. In anticipation of where this is leading, a second point about Augustine that I want to emphasize here is that as a philosopher he was a Platonist. This obviously invites an intertextual investigation of the Platonic tradition in respect of Providence in history and that of Augustine. So I want to conclude this talk by claiming, without any hint of exaggeration, that Augustine's City of God, written in the early 5th century AD, can be meaningfully and profitably read as, at least to some extent, a recasting of Plato's Republic. The main point of difference between these two will be the difference between a cyclical cosmology and a linear eschatology. And it's the cyclical cosmology which stands as the main obstacle to the essentially Christian idea that human history itself can be fully meaningful in the sense of having an objective purpose. So next, I will return to look more deeply into Augustine's ideas of providential history, his Platonic background, but also his biblical sources. In final summary, like philosophy, history too emerges from mythology, two of the fruits of the transformative shift from mythos to logos. Homer operated with two causes, human and divine, the latter including what we would call natural causes. One of the first fruits of philosophy was the discovery of nature as a distinct domain, and so for a historian like Polybius, there are three causes: human rational action, natural causes, and a third, which he calls fortune. Already in Plato we see the beginnings of yet another cause, what we call here divine providence, and which reaches an unprecedented level of development in St. Augustine's great work, The City of God. We might end then with a question: does providence supplant or supplement fortune? In other words, are there 3 or 4 causes at work in history? As always, please do subscribe if you like this kind of content and press the like button for the video. But for now though, thank you for your attention.